Hi, welcome to Math 87, Lesson 132. Now, in this lesson, we're going to talk about compound probability. Now, we know the probability of getting heads on one toss of a coin is 1/2. We can state this fact with the following equation, in which PH equals 1/2. P stands for probability, H stands for heads. Now, the probability of getting 2 heads in a row is 1/2 times 1/2, or 1/4. Now, we can see this if we draw a diagram. If we toss a coin one time, we get heads or tails. So with one toss, we either have heads or tails. If the first toss comes up heads, the second toss could come up either heads or tails. So our first toss came up heads. The second toss could be heads or tails. If the first toss came up tails and the second toss came up either heads or tails, then we could have 4 possibilities. We see that if the first toss came up heads, it could either come up heads or it could come up tails. We see if the first toss comes up tails, it could either come up heads or it could come up tails. The probability of each of these 4 outcomes, so either one of these outcomes, is 1/4. Thus, the probability of rolling heads and heads equals 1/4. So we have the probability of heads and heads equals 1/4. So the probability that an event occurring in a specific order is the product of the possibilities of each event. So the probability of rolling heads, tails equals the probability of rolling heads is 1/2. The probability of rolling heads is 1/2. The probability of rolling tails is 1/2. So the probability of rolling heads, tails is the product of 1/2, 1/2, 1/2, which equals 1/8. So let's do another one. The product of rolling heads, tails, heads. Again, heads is 1/2, tails is 1/2. We add all those probabilities up, we multiply all those probabilities, and we get 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/8. 1/4. 1/4 times 1/2 is 1/8. 1/8 times 1/2 is 1/16. So we could go on. We could keep going with this. The probability of tails, heads, tails is 1/2 multiplied by 1/2, multiplied by 1/2, multiplied by 1/2, and multiplied by 1/2 again, which equals 1/32, 1/32. So again, the probability is the product of independent events occurring in a specific order. So you multiply the possibility of each event. So looking at this, what is the probability that on the first spin will land on 2 and on the second spin will land on 1? Again, P standing for probability. So looking at this, the probability of landing on 2 is 1 out of 4. So we have 1 out of 4 possibilities. The probability of landing on 1 is 1 out of 4 possibilities. We find the product of these 2 probabilities, and we see that the probability of landing on 2 on the first spin and 1 on the second spin is 1/16. Now, Jim tossed a coin once and it turned up heads. What is the probability that he will get heads on the next toss of the coin? Past events don't affect the probability of future events. So the probability with him getting heads on the first toss, it does not affect what the probability of him getting heads on the second toss is. And the probability of getting heads on any coin toss is 1/2. So the answer to the question, Jim tossed a coin once and it turned up heads, what is the probability that he will get heads on the next toss of the coin, is still just 1/2. Now, let's do one more. What is the probability of rolling a 4 and then a number above 3 in 2 rolls of a single die? So we have the probability of rolling a 4. Well, there are 6 numbers on the die, and so we know the probability of rolling a 4 is 1/6. What is the probability of rolling a number greater than 3? Well, there are 3 numbers greater than 3 on a die, so the probability is 1/2, with 3/6, which reduces to 1/2. So the probability of rolling a 4 and then a greater than 3 would be 1/6 multiplied by 1/2, which equals 1/12. And I wrote that wrong, so let me correct it. So again, what you need to remember is the probability of an event or independent events occurring in a specific order is the product of the probability of each event. And that's called compound product, or compound probability, I'm sorry. Now, you do have a couple of practice problems. I'd like you to practice those to see if you understand this concept. I will put the answers to the practice problems in Canvas under the practice page, the practice problems answer page. Thank you.